if we're streaming, we better say so.
Yeah. Okay. We are live now. All right. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to Q&A with the Reverend Jerry Keucher on How Much is Your Congregation's Space Worth, which is an article that was published in the September issue of ECF Vital Practices. This is a 30-minute conversation that I'll be having with Jerry, and I would invite you, those of you who have registered and are participating on Zoom, as well as those of you who are seeing us on Facebook Live, to type your questions into either the chat box or the comment section, and I will add them to the list. Just a few words before we begin the conversation by way of introduction. The Reverend Jerry Keucher is an Episcopal priest and is an author of Remember the Future, Financial Leadership and Asset Management for Congregations, and Back from the Dead, the Book of Congregational Growth. He serves as a priest in charge at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Brooklyn, New York, and is also an ECF consultant. He has held a variety of positions, including as the Chief of Finance and Operations for the Episcopal Diocese of New York. I want to also add that this article, as well as this Q&A, has been made possible by a grant from the Lilly Endowment National Initiative to ECF to host a series of conversations about the economic challenges facing congregations and kind of practical steps that they can take to address those challenges. And so without any further ado, I would want to just welcome again Jerry, and start off by a conversation, or start off by a question about, I guess, intent. A lot of congregations are renting space. Some of them, I understand, are doing that well. Some of them not quite as well. And you mentioned that you think that one of the most important questions for them to ask first is kind of determining the purpose of why they're renting space. So I'm wondering if you could just elaborate more on that.
Right. I mean, I have said in other contexts that mixed motives make a mess. We got to be clear about why we're doing what we're doing and what we hope to accomplish. I mean, with space, there are a couple of things that you can accomplish with it. If you have the money and you can afford it, you can do ministry in those spaces that costs you money. You might try to aim for a kind of semi-outreach program or something where at least you break even. Or you might actually need to make money, which is perfectly all right. It's perfectly all right to make money. I stress that because a lot of times we feel guilty about that, but there can be consequences that we have to think through. But a lot of people make a lot of money on real estate, and if the goal is to make money, we can certainly do that. But here's an example of something that I actually encountered in more than one parish. The rectory the ground floor had been turned into offices or program space or something. And so there was an apartment on the second floor. And so the vestry said, well, we kind of need a sexton, so why don't we hire somebody and give them housing on the second floor of the rectory? And so in order to be nice, they hired a woman with a history of some problems and set up the thing. So there was supposed to be a sexton, there was supposed to be housing for this woman, and and the parish was not supposed to be losing money on it. Well, they didn't accomplish any of those things because, of course, there wasn't a job description. So she didn't know what she was supposed to do, and people had lots of different expectations about what she was going to do. So people weren't always very nice to her about the state of the plant, and weren't very good landlords about keeping up the apartment. And she was sort of resentful, and actually it ended up that nothing that people had hope might happen happened. So it's good to be clear about why you're doing it. And one of the things, I mean, the tool that was provided with this article in September was a rough and ready method of allowing you to determine how much it costs you to make your space available. So that even if you open it to a bunch of 12-step programs, it's good to know how much it costs you to run that room for a couple of hours, so that you're not losing money on it, unless you intend to lose money and have talked about the consequences of not having that money. Does that all make sense?
Yes, it does. We actually have a question in response to this very specific issue. So participant asks, our parish has a vacant rectory that we are exploring repurposing for the purpose of community ministry, offering meeting space for nonprofits with a clear usage agreement, but with no goal of the church making a profit. Regarding tax implications, our archdeacon has said that if we were to, for example, lease a room to a pastoral counselor at cost, with the church only covering costs, it does not imperil our exempt status, even if the counselor is for profit. Is this a fair statement?
Well, in most property taxes are administered locally, and usually the specific terms of the tax exemption for religious not-for-profits or all not-for-profits is decided by each state. So I can't make a blanket assertion. In New York State, it can be a problem to rent to any for-profit entity if you're leasing. Leasing means that you're giving somebody exclusive use of a part of your space, like leasing an apartment. You can't use that apartment for your coffee hour. If you have shared space that's used by different people at different times for different purposes, the agreements that you make with them are technically called licenses rather than leases. And I don't know of any circumstances where licensing the use of a multi-use room for a few hours to a for-profit yoga class or something would have property tax implications. Leases can have property tax implications, and ones made to for-profit entities are, I think, you'd have to check it out. In New York, you can rent to not-for-profits and make 20% above your carrying costs without property tax consequences. On the other hand, there is nothing wrong about having part of your property go back on the property tax rolls. Commercial landlords pay property taxes and make money. It's just one of the costs you have to factor in to the rent. One way is to draw up the lease arrangement, providing that if the occupancy of the tenant generates any government charges, that the tenant will reimburse you for those. You want to pay the taxes because it's your property and you don't want it to go in rem, but the tenant it can be set up so the tenant reimburses you. Or if you know, like for example, if you're going to rent a house, your rectory is on a separate tax lot or even the same tax lot as the church, and you aren't using it for clergy housing, you want to rent it on the rental market, fine. It'll go back on the property tax rolls for the period that you're renting it out, and you just have to set the rent the way all landlords do, taking into account your costs, which include a reserve so that you can do the repairs that you need to do on the house to keep it in rentable condition.
Great, thank you.
Small question with a big
many pieces. A very specific question. So I kind of want to back up just a little bit to, I think, the 3 steps that you mentioned in your article for determining cost. You mentioned the 3 steps are checking with the local real estate agents about the value of similar spaces, spending time determining cost of operating the space, and determining what the prospective user can afford to pay.
Right.
of the three, I'm wondering if you could share kind of which one you see congregations struggling with the most.
Well,
all three.
Well, I think in some ways it can be the finding out what similar space is worth in the local market can be easy. It can also be a little more, a little tougher. I mean, if you have your parish hall, with a kitchen, and you want to rent it out for private parties, you need to find out what a bar or a restaurant or the Masonic Lodge or whatever would ask for a similar kind of event. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. It's just amazing how often it doesn't get done. The tool that I devised, that was actually something that the Diocese of New York uses to help parishes actually save a little money on their assessment, asks you just to measure all your spaces, figure out how many hours a week and how many weeks a year they're used either by the parish or by outside groups, what the costs of running the spaces are, and then you have a clue about what it costs you to provide 1 square foot of space for 1 hour. And you multiply that out times the size of your room. So if you have an ARP group that meets once a month, you have a reasonable number that you can ask them, and you have some rational basis for saying it costs us this much plus the sexton's overtime to host this meeting. The only one that we generally do is to say, well, what do you think you can pay?
Yes, right. That's the one that happens. Right. You mentioned both in the article and then here in this conversation, have 2 examples of congregations that haven't necessarily done those 3 steps and are in fact losing some money. I'm wondering if you could talk about an example of a congregation that has done those 3 steps well, or just sort of an example of a congregation that is using their space rental
right.
to earn money.
A lot of parishes have some kind of nursery school. And some of them, I mean, the ones I will talk about of happy cases, or at least in my estimation, happy cases, are parishes where there was certainly unused space. Maybe it had been an education wing, built during the baby boom or something, and now not needed. And they actually did a survey of what it would cost a nursery school to rent. This was not an in-parish operation. What it would cost an agency like that to rent space in the community, what it would cost them, and they actually make money on the deal, which is fine. That can sometimes get complicated because sometimes the part of the space is shared on Sundays with the parish or something like that. There are lots of peculiarities. I'm kind of surprised at how frequently nursery schools, especially if they're parish operations, lose money and lose a considerable amount of money. And it has to do with us being nice. We want to be nice. So if, we'll set up a sliding scale fee arrangement, even though it's the parish operating budget that has to eat that money. And there hasn't really been a discussion about, is that really what we want to do with our money? Can we afford to do that? Is that the best thing? When there are plenty of nursery schools that operate at a profit, it just, we're fiduciaries of an institution that doesn't belong to us.
Right.
And so the idea, the prudent rule of care, the duty of care that fiduciaries have basically means that you're going to treat it even better than you treat your own stuff. And yet we do things with parish financial arrangements that we never do with our own property or in our own lives. And I think it comes from just a misguided notion that we have to be we can be generous with the parish's resources, more generous perhaps than we are with our own.
And I also think it goes back to the original kind of question of intent that you raised at the beginning. Because there are, as you noted, instances in which congregations want to rent their space at cost or even at a loss. But I hear one of the things that you're saying is that oftentimes that conversation is actually never held. The determination is never made.
Well, right. And we also, have a tendency, especially if it's something the clergy want, we clerics have a tendency to try to theologize our own preferences, basically by making it, if we don't do it this way, you're a mean, stingy, bad person. And, we got to figure out a way to have rational discussions about these things without moral overtones. As I say, we also hobble ourselves by thinking, oh, if we rent space to anybody, we'll lose our 501c3. No, you won't. The richest parish in the world, Trinity Wall Street, is a real estate corporation. And they're a 501c3. All of the commercial property is on the property tax rolls, but you can run it in a way that accomplishes whatever purpose it is that you have, which is why it's so necessary to be clear about the purpose. Trinity does not run its commercial real estate as a charity.
Right.
They use it to generate the resources to be charitable in other contexts.
Their granting program, for instance. You mentioned partly the clergy's role, and I guess one of the questions in reading that I had while reading over the article was, who do you imagine going through these three steps? Primarily, is this the vestry? Is this the property committee? Is it typically the clergy person who's sort of pushing this agenda? Yes, all three.
Well, it kind of depends on the size of the parish and kind of who wants this more than anybody. I think a sensible, effective priest who sees the opportunity to use space that it would otherwise just be sitting there for a purpose that can help support the operation and the mission of the parish might possibly walk around with a tape measure.
Yes.
Otherwise, if somebody else, a lay leader, sees the same opportunity, he or she might do it. I mean, there's no, I think in most contexts it'll depend on who wants it.
Yeah. And okay. Makes sense. Do you feel that more and more, given as congregations become a little bit, well, not just a little bit, but more financially constrained,
right?
More people will be wanting this within the congregation.
Well, I know, and there's been a lot of talk about it. I mean, the Partners for Sacred Spaces have written a lot about it and stuff like that. You don't have to use a lot of fancy language. I mean, look, in a lot of our Sunday school wings were built during the 1950s and early 60s. I'm one of 4 children, which was not exceptional at all when I was a child. And now it seems like, somebody should have taken some steps before that. Even if you had the same number of families that you had in 1960, you'd have about 1/3 as many kids, So the space is there, and probably it's just being used to store things that might be better off in a dumpster. So you can do something with it. Find maybe a government contract program, like, people that are remanded to do community service or a GED program or anything, I mean, there are all kinds of things that are perfectly consonant with the mission of the church, and probably with the zoning of your building. You do have to, that's why you probably can't put a deli in there. You have to think about zoning. Your neighbors, if they don't like the use, they may help you think about the zoning.
Right. A full school, for instance, is maybe right. I've definitely heard of those instances. We've touched on this a little bit, the difference between licensing and leasing space, and the considerations that the different sort of considerations that congregations need to make when making that determination. I'm wondering if you could just go into a little bit more detail about that.
Yeah, licensing means that you're allowing somebody either on a one-off or every week or 3 times a week to use part of your space from 2 o'clock in the afternoon until 6, and you're charging them a fee for the use of the space. Oh, and don't call it a donation. What we're talking about is rent. It's perfectly okay. We don't have to try to pretend that it's a gift, because of course it's not a gift, because the person is getting something in return for their money. Leasing means that you're giving somebody exclusive use of the space. You may have access for emergencies or some other thing, but in general, you have to treat it like a house or an apartment that you were renting. You do not have the right, once the lease is signed, just to go into it anytime you want. And it's not shared. Typically, licensing spaces that are licensed are used by the parish and other groups and stuff. Your 12-step meetings are licenses.
Okay.
And so the space use agreement that you have for a licensing arrangement can be very, very simple. A lease can be a very complicated document. Okay. And you never need the approval of the Bishop and Standing Committee to license spaces, but you do need the diocesan approvals. In some dioceses, it's for any lease. In others, it's for leases that last longer than a particular term, as well as mortgaging or selling the property.
You touched on this a little bit earlier. Just want to go back to it. Are there specific tax implications for leasing space to an outside group that folks need to know?
There can be. Some are really easy. If you have a house or an apartment that is off the tax rolls because it's supposed to be used for clergy housing, and you want to rent it out to somebody who's not your cleric, that should properly go back on the property tax rolls. Your local taxing jurisdiction, here in the city, New York City, they're very accustomed to measuring square feet and figuring out the percentage of whatever building it is that goes back on the tax rolls. But there'll be some kind of proportional percentage of the square footage that goes back on the property tax rolls. Other ones, it kind of depends on, it kind of depends on enforcement. It kind of depends on the customs of the local jurisdiction or the pressures that they're under to raise property tax revenue. But any lease, especially one that other than a not-for-profit that basically just covers your costs, any lease might have the potential to trigger the property being put back on the property tax rolls. But again, that's not the end of the world. Perfectly okay. Just you have to think about it in advance and plan for it. What would we do if it did go back on the property tax rolls?
Okay, great. We do have actually 2 questions.
Oh, good.
And I'm going to see if we can bring Tony Hagerman into...
good. It's like a radio call-in show.
Yes, it is.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, hey.
Thank you for calling on me. I work for a ministry owned by the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina, and we are located in a building that formerly was occupied by a church. The church was closed in 2013, and now we run a ministry that's operated under the diocese's authority. And there's no parish, there's no priest, there's no offering plate, there's no, there's no congregation. We do allow 4 little ethnic congregations to use the property on Sunday for worship. So we call ourselves a church still because we have worship happening on Sundays, but there's no Anglican worship going on there. We share the building with 6 other nonprofits at present. All 6 of them together pay us $600 a month. So we are basically existing to offer the building to these nonprofits, kind of an incubator for these groups. One of them is a counselor, on-site mental health professional, and she is set up as a for-profit at present. She pays us 0 rent, but she is a for-profit, and we have a lot of different opinions on whether or not we need to have her jump through the hoops to become a nonprofit instead of a for-profit. So I just, as I'm hearing you talk about recouping your costs, maybe being a threshold, we don't recoup our costs with anybody. So I just wondered if you could speak to our particular situation.
Well, I assume if it's an extinct Episcopal parish, the diocese owns the property.
Correct.
And so I guess the diocese is eating the loss on the operation of the property.
We're raising funds. We are not written into their budget.
Okay. So you're responsible for making up that operating deficit.
Yes.
Well, okay. With regard to the counselor who is not for profit, did you say she wasn't paying anything?
She hasn't yet. Her agreement is set up that she will, provide a percentage of her profits, but she is it's a new practice, and we're just at the point where we are needing to have a conversation with her at the time to, pony up. But there's more issues with her since she is set up as a for-profit.
Right, and hers. I mean, all of these agencies have exclusive use of whatever spaces they're occupying.
Yes, those 6. There are others that are licensed, but those 6 are leased.
Okay, all right. Well, I think you need to check with a local attorney about how exactly North Carolina's property tax exemption law works. To know. I wouldn't think you're in any danger as long as she's not paying you anything, but I don't know. I mean, it could be that the agreement that you have that calls for a percentage of the profits might be a problem.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Jerry.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Tony. And I think this partly also underscores the need to kind of go through thinking about some of the intent behind kind of the overall goal, and then also the steps. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Let me just.
I know that parishes have gotten into trouble with Montessori schools because they're generally set up as for-profit.
Okay.
I mean, they're not into trouble. It's triggered putting it back on the property tax rolls in the parish. The financial arrangement they made with the school didn't foresee that. It wasn't trouble. It was just failure to plan.
Okay. So great additional question from Nicole Morrell, and I think given the time, this will be our last one.
Okay.
It's a follow-up to this space use conversation. She asks, is there specific language that a diocese or the national church offers, or is it up to individual churches to create their own policy on these issues?
Policies? You mean to create the agreements?
I suppose so. Yeah, I think so.
Well, there are, of course, diocesan websites change a lot, but there are templates on some diocesan websites, that set out. I remember, whether they still do it or not, the Diocese of Connecticut used to have 6 different templates that went from, like an AA meeting to a lease as sort of a starting point, a basis. So try to find one of those templates. This is another thing. If it's going to be a complicated arrangement, if it's going to be a lease negotiation, and if the prospective tenant has a lawyer, you need a lawyer. Do not rely on this prospective tenant's lawyer to draft the lease and keep your interests in mind, okay? You're not paying them. So in these things, pay for the professional services that you need in order to do a good job with this. It'll cost you less in the long run.
Okay. Well, with that, I think, again, thank you, Jerry, for this conversation. For those who are joining on Facebook, I included a link to the article itself. And Jerry, if people have additional questions, could you share your email address so that they can reach out?
It's Jerry Keucher, JerryKeucher @gmail. And my cell phone is 347-713-2218. I think both of those pieces of contact information are in the article if you go to the website.
Yes, they are. Okay. Well, thank you again very much.
Thank you all.
Everyone who attended.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.